Next up, we'll jump right into Danielle Prevost. She's the Conservation Project Developer with the Canadian Wildlife Service Environment Canada. She works throughout the Pacific with partners and stakeholders, including landowners, land managers, Indigenous peoples, industry, and local government for anything to do with species at risk. And she's going to be providing us with the federal context. So I'll hand it over to you, Danielle.
Thank you both for inviting me as well, and Lynn for providing some context around species at risk in BC. As Christine mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the Species at Risk Act, the federal piece of legislation, and trying to focus in on partnerships that are enabling species at risk to survive and recover, because as Lynn mentioned, partnerships and everyone playing a role in recovery of species at risk is really important to see the outcomes that we're trying to achieve through the Species at Risk Act, which is to prevent species from disappearing from Canada and wherever possible to help them recover. What I'll start with is talking about the Act itself. So the Species at Risk Act applies on all lands and waters across Canada. Where it differs depends on land tenure. And because I'm with Environment and Climate Change Canada, I'm going to focus on terrestrial species. We're responsible for terrestrial species, fisheries, and oceans, primarily for aquatic species, and Parks Canada for species that are found on parks land. And given the topic for today, I'm really going to focus on terrestrial species on non-federal land. So that would be your private land and your provincial crown land. This graphic here shows Canada as a pie chart. So if you imagine all the lands and waters in Canada as a pie chart, you can see that the federal government is responsible directly for a really small piece of that pie. So it's federal land as well as aquatic species and migratory birds under the Migratory Birds Convention Act. And the rest of Canada is primarily under the responsibility of the provinces and territories, and then, of course, by extension, local governments. However, there is a caveat here that the federal government has the role to assess whether species are protected by the provinces and territories. So I'll get into what that looks like. To start off and looking at protection of species at risk in BC, what are we really looking at? Right now, we have 165 federally listed terrestrial species, and 31 new species could be added at any time. Every year we go out and we consult on changes to the federal list of species at risk, and 31, the consultation on those species have ended, so changes could be happening to the list at any time. And you may also or may not be aware that Environment Canada, Environment and Climate Change Canada, were behind on producing recovery documents as identified in SARA. So SARA lays out a timeline for developing documents for species listed as extirpated, so locally extinct, endangered, threatened, and then special concern. We're heading into year 3 of the 3-year plan, and over these 3 years, we are focused on producing approximately 86 recovery documents. And for the extirpated, endangered, and threatened species, many of them we develop or identify critical habitat. And this map here is just to give you a rough sense of where critical habitat has been identified to date based on region. And really just to draw your attention to this part down here, as Lynn was saying, where people like to live is where species like to live as well in a lot of cases. So no surprise that in these high dense areas there are a lot of species at risk. But notwithstanding, there's also species throughout the province. And as I mentioned, we're moving into year 3 of this plan. And many of the species in year 3 are ones which will have critical habitat identified. All that to say, for those of you who are involved in reviewing and working with recovery documents, more to be coming your way. So critical habitat, what does that look like? Critical habitat is the habitat the species needs to survive or recover, and it's identified in a final recovery strategy, so meaning a recovery strategy that has been posted online at the SARA registry, or an action plan. Critical habitat is identified using two factors, generally speaking: the area within which critical habitat is found. So if you look at this example map here, the lines around this area identify the area within which critical habitat is found. But it's important that it's also taken into consideration the biophysical attributes. So this map here is a map of critical habitat for the Pacific water shrew. So biophysical attributes could include things like flooded forests, water courses, downwood. And so it's important to take these two factors into consideration, because as you can see in this map, there's a freeway going through critical habitat. So critical habitat would not involve a freeway. So that's why it's important to take both biophysical attributes and critical habitat into the mapping into account. I like to reference these lines as the areas to look for critical habitat within. They're a guide. They're based on the best available information. And so critical habitat could be found outside of these lines as well as within the lines. And our hope is that critical habitat found outside the lines would be treated just the same. And as more knowledge and information about critical habitat comes available, we are able to update the recovery documents to reflect those changes. Some people ask me, well, critical habitat, how do you go about identifying it? And it really depends on the species. This picture here is of a provincial and federal biologists with their heads literally together, noses to the ground, looking for an endangered moss. So sometimes it's that detailed. Sometimes it's things like aerial photos or computer models or combinations of various techniques. So the best information we have is what informs the identification of critical habitat. And as Lynn mentioned, there's an accord between BC and Canada that enables or facilitates this collaboration. And one of the key things within this collaboration is working together on the development of recovery documents. And we have two options for developing recovery documents. One option is to produce a federal recovery document, and we typically do this when a species crosses provincial or territorial boundaries, or when the species is a migratory bird. For other species that are found within BC, oftentimes BC will take the lead on producing a recovery document, and then we will adopt that provincial document as a federal document. So if you're wondering why some species have two recovery plans, that could be the reason. So when we adopt a provincial recovery strategy as a federal recovery strategy, we have to ensure that it's in alignment with SARA. So this is, again, an example of the Pacific Water Shrew Recovery Strategy, which is one that's been finalized, is on the web. So when we adopted the provincial recovery strategy to align it with SARA, we needed to remove the socioeconomic considerations. Under SARA, socioeconomic factors come into play at the time of listing a species and also at the point of action planning for the species. This in-between stage, developing of recovery strategies, is all about the species. It's all about the science, the local knowledge, the Aboriginal traditional knowledge that informs our understanding of the species, what it needs, and the threats that it is facing. And this information then can inform the actions we will take and all of the factors associated with that. So with these recovery strategies, we may add on components as well as remove components. So with Pacific Water Shrew, in this case, we added in the species status information, the recovery feasibility, the population and distribution objectives, so how many individuals over what area is required to stabilize and hopefully recover the population, and the critical habitat. So if you are working with a species that has these two documents and the provincial adopted as the federal, it's very important to look at the critical habitat. we are working, BC and Canada, working together to bring our recovery documents into better alignment, but some of the older ones you will see survival and recovery habitat in a provincial document and critical habitat in the federal document. Critical habitat is what we are assessing the protection on. So that's what you're going to want to pay closer attention to for land management decisions. And as Lynn mentioned, BC has a suite of legislation that can help with protecting species at risk. BC does not have species at risk specific legislation, but they do have a lot of tools. And again, as I mentioned, if you look at Canada as a pie chart, our role in Environment and Climate Change Canada is to assess that protection. So when we're assessing that protection, we are looking at BC's full suite of species that Lynn brought up, as well as the tools of local government. So bylaws, official community plans, permits, etc. And one thing I would like to draw your attention to is obtaining critical habitat from us. It's really hard to know what to look out for if you don't know where it is on the landscape. So one thing we've been working really hard on is getting our data out to landowners and land managers who are making decisions, choosing to take actions that can help conserve habitat for these species. And you can now find critical habitat data on our website, so the SARA registry website, and that's critical habitat data associated with documents that have been posted to the registry. And there's also an option to have access to draft critical habitat data. And we can establish a data licensing agreement to do that, and if there's interest, please do contact me. Several local governments, First Nations, and others have set up data licensing agreements to have the data, even though it's in a rough state, where possible, to use it to inform future decisions. With all those legislative tools that the province and local governments have, our role then is to assess effective protection. Effective protection is a term used to describe protection of species on non-federal land. So again, your private and your provincial crown land. And when we're talking about effective, we're talking about as effective as SARA. So does the protection we're assessing meet the same standards as SARA? Is it as effective as SARA? So first off, we look at the provincial and local government tools and assess whether they're as effective as SARA. If not, if there are any gaps in protection for a particular species, then we look to the tools that we have within SARA where we have the opportunity to provide effective protection. And one of those tools that we're currently exploring is conservation agreements, and these are agreements between federal crown and landowner and land manager that talks about what will be done to ensure the protection. So this is an agreement that can be done under SARA as another option. And then finally, if through steps 1 and step 2, we're still finding that there's gaps in protection, there is the possibility of a SARA safety net order. It's often referred to as a safety net order, or the backstop to protection. How that works is after steps 1 and 2, if we're still finding gaps in protection, then we need to go to our minister and inform the minister that we believe there are gaps in protection. The minister then informs an opinion as to whether there are gaps or not. If she is of the opinion that there's not gaps or we can fill the gaps, we may be directed to go back and try to do more to fill those gaps through the methods identified in steps 1 and 2. But if she is of the opinion that there are gaps in protection, then she must go to Governor and Council, which is essentially Cabinet, and inform them that we've tried steps 1 and 2 and gaps in protection still remain. Then it is up to Governor and Council to make the decision as to use SARA or not to provide that protection. What this could look like then, protection on the ground, it could stop with the provincial and local government tools. If they meet that test of effective protection, then that may be sufficient in and of itself. If not, if Governor and Council does decide to go ahead with the tools under SARA, there's various options that could flow out of that. To date, there has only been one emergency order for the greater sage-grouse found in the prairies, and potential other order being considered for frog in Quebec. So you can see that last bullet there, orders, tools, legislative tools under SARA being considered the last resort. And I really want to emphasize that last resort, because it's our intention to provide protection through existing tools and existing actions landowners, land managers want to take, because it's a belief that through those methods will be most effective. And SARA, again, is really used as a backstop, as a last resort. To ensure that critical habitat is protected, we do need all land managers and landowners, decision makers, those who are influencing decisions on the land, who are providing advice and information to help ensure that species survive and recover. So some of the ways you could help is finding out if there are species at risk on the sites you are working at. I recognize that there's a number of sources of information, such as the Species at Risk Public Registry, such as the various tools Lynn mentioned, other tools that the conservation community has put together. There are a lot of sources of information, and people being very busy as they are, it can be a challenge, but very important to make yourself aware of the species at risk, particularly on the sites you're working. If you do identify that there's a potential for the species or the habitat in the area, become familiar with the recovery strategy. Become familiar with those biophysical attributes of the critical habitat and the threats that the species is facing. And as you do your work, as I mentioned, critical habitat is identified based on the best information we have. So any information input you could provide to help us refine or inform that critical habitat mapping and data is very important. Also ensure that you have the information you need about those species. As you can appreciate, our knowledge is continually growing about the different species, and species experts are out there collecting information and refining their knowledge. So I really recommend that people contact recovery teams where they exist. And you can also contact, as Lynn was mentioning, the province or us, because we collaborate on species at risk recovery documents, and we can help connect you to the right people. Obtaining the critical habitat information either through our website or the data licensing agreement. And Lynn also mentioned the Develop for Care suite of documents, which are also very informative. Really encourage people to report their current data to the CDC. The Conservation Data Center is a tool we use to pull information to help, again, with the identification of critical habitat and our knowledge of the species. So reporting data is really key. And then finally, wherever possible, help us provide landowners with information. Recovery documents are very dense documents in a lot of cases with a lot of information, and SARA is not, generally speaking, a well understood piece of legislation. So if you have this information about critical habitat, seeing that map, knowing that it's not a no-go zone, knowing that activities can happen as long as they don't result in the destruction of the critical habitat, as long as people are trying to protect species through steps 1 and 2, and only if there is an order in place, being concerned directly about the destruction of critical habitat, that information to landowners can help inform decisions they make and actions they take. So any way we can get more information out and correct information out would be really helpful. And always, you have my contact information now, a resource to help connect you or the people you're working with to the right individuals within either Environment Canada or the province or elsewhere who can help provide clarity or information around SARA. And that just segues into this next slide here about ways we can collaborate. Partnerships with conservation organizations like we're doing today with South Coast Conservation Program. Mapping, technical support, planning support, that was speaking to those connections that I can help facilitate, and others within the province and federal government as well. Co-developing resources, for example, stewardship practices, so looking at different species, the different land uses and potential threats, and then looking at ways in which people can address those threats through stewardship. And landowners, land managers are closest to what's happening, have a great understanding of the land and what is needed. And if there are other ways we can go about doing this, very open to having discussions and exploring other opportunities. And then finally, sometimes people ask me, well, are there successes? Do we see recovery happening? And so I just wanted to leave with one short example here. This example is Sayuk First Nation, and this is looking at their coastal sand dune ecosystem. Through funding support from Environment Canada, so the Aboriginal Fund for Species at Risk, and we do have a series of funding programs that can support conservation and recovery of species at risk. Through some support from us and from others, First Nation collaborated with local governments, community members, biologists, conservation organizations, and undertook this effort to they've practically removed all of the invasive species in this area that is very sensitive and sensitive habitat for species at risk, also important habitat for cultural land use. And they have developed this beautiful signage here, have done education outreach to community members to let people know more about the land values here and the species and their habitat, and really showcasing with collaboration and with a lot of dedication on the end of Sayut and all of their partners that it is possible. You can demonstrate recovery, conservation of habitat for species at risk. So I'll leave it with that and my contact information there at the end. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Danielle, for that thorough run-through of the Species at Risk Act.